A good afternoon to those of you on the East Coast. A good morning to those of you in the Central Pacific time zone. Those will be watching from Europe, Israel, want to wish you a good evening. And those watching on JBN, on the Jewish Broadcasting Network, it's an honor to have you. And each and every week, we really appreciate your participation. Our situation is this. It's a leap year. As you know, the Jewish calendar works off of a lunar calendar, not a solar calendar. However, there's an obligation, twice in the Torah, there's an obligation to make sure that Passover is observed after the spring equinox, as well as Sukkot is observed after the autumnal, equinox. So what happens is, out of a 19-year cycle, every 19 years, you're going to have 7 years that are known as leap years. What does that mean? It means that instead of having 12 months of 29 and a half days, and obviously you can't have a month of 29 and a half days, so 6 months will be 29-day months, 6 months are 30-day months. That's a typical year. 354 days. 6 of them are 29-day months, 6 of them are 30-day months. But 7 out of 19 years, you get a 13th month. Because of the fact that it's a leap year, it pushes off the holidays. Rosh Hashanah started late, Sukkot started late. Likewise, this year, Hanukkah is very late. In the last number of years, we've had Hanukkah that was as early as right after Thanksgiving. This year, Hanukkah is in the last week of December. So what we're going to do today is something a little different than we normally do. We did this last year, we're going to do it this year. And that is analyze Hanukkah, contextualize and analyze Hanukkah, and talk about its relevance for what we're experiencing in the context of Syria, in the context of Persia, in the context of Lebanon, of Gaza, etc. Let's start with the story of Hanukkah. And to appreciate it, we have to start a little bit earlier. You and I know that from the time the Jews came into Israel, from the time the Jews inhabited Israel under Joshua, there was a very, very significant amount of time where you had the land of Israel was the west bank of the Jordan River, the east bank of the Jordan River. Already before Joshua's time, in the time of Moses, the east bank, what's today's Jordan, today's southern Syria, the Golan Heights and north of that, that was inhabited by the Jews in the time of Moses. His last year of his leadership, when they were no longer in the desert, they conquered all of the east side, today's Jordan, and today's southern Syria. Under Joshua, they crossed the Jordan River, starting with Jericho. They ultimately conquer and settle the west bank of the Jordan. When I say the west bank, I mean from the river to the sea was Israel. Okay, it was always Israel. It expands under King David, so that it's not just the west bank of the Jordan River, from the river to the sea is Israel, but it's as well as the east bank of the Jordan River. But under David, most of today's Syria became part of Israel, and a good part of today's Lebanon became part of what was known as biblical Israel. That was true under Solomon. After King Solomon, unfortunately, there was a leader by the name of Jerovam, or in Hebrew, Yerovam ben Nevat, and he seceded with 10 of the 12 states. We say 10 of the 12 tribes. It was a bloodless succession because King Solomon's son Rehoboam, he realized all he's going to do is set off a civil war. It'll be bloodshed, both sides will lose. And he did allow it to happen. And you had the 10 northern tribes that we refer to as Israel or Samaria, because Shomron or Samaria was the capital city, and the 2 southern tribes known as Judea. Why were they known as Judea? Because Judah and Benjamin, Judah was the much larger populated state of the two. There were many more Judeans than there were Benjamites, so it was known as Judea. The Assyrians, there was always a great northern empire, of which Israel was a bridge between that and the great southern empire. The southern empire was known as Mitzrayim. In English, we call it Egypt. It's unfair to refer to it as Egypt because Mitzrayim was probably the northern third of the African continent. It was the whole Nile River basin, today's Egypt, Sudan, Libya, etc. It was not just northeastern part of the upper third of the African continent. It also included most of the northwestern part of the continent as well. And it went as far south as Black Africa, meaning as far south as what's today's Eritrea, Kenya, Uganda. That was not part of Egypt. That was known as Kush, Black Africa. Mitzrayim was anything north of that. But it was a huge, massive empire. That was a southern empire. And it was always called Mitzrayim. And again, I'm using the term Egypt. Egypt doesn't do justice to what it was. In the north, it depends on what point in history. You had a northern empire by the name of Aram. Then you had a northern empire by the name of Ashur, Assyria. And if you go in London to the British Museum, there's a fascinating section known as the Assyrian section that really gives us, a historical insight into some of the government features, economic features, cultural features of Assyria. And then there was Babylonia. Today, Babylonia is defined as Iraq. That's the modern term that was created after Sykes-Picot, when the French and the British carved up most of the Arab lands. But historically, it was known as Babylonia. So what was Aram? What was Ashur? What was Bavel? Just very briefly. Aram was primarily today's Syria, part of Western Turkey. Ashur was much larger than that. It was most of today's Turkey, Syria. It may have been a small chunk of today's Iraq. Bavel was situated along the Fertile Crescent. When I say the Fertile Crescent, meaning those areas, very fertile land between the Euphrates and Tigris River. Today, again, it's known as Iraq, Bavel. But Bavel went on to conquer most of today's Turkey, today's Syria, Lebanon, etc. It eventually conquered Israel, eventually defeats North Africa, Mitzrayim. It was a great, great empire. When I say great, I don't mean in the moral, ethical sense, meaning in terms of the conquest sense. So Bavel actually conquers Judea. And the Jews, most of them, not all of them, but most of them, are taken into captivity into today's Iraq. There's a tributary, the Kfar. It's a tributary off of the Euphrates River. There were concentration camps there. Not death camps, but concentration camps. Eventually, these exiles, many of them become members of the government and help expand the Babylonian Empire economically. The famous Daniel is one of those. Many of the Jews create diaspora communities there and are quite successful and contribute to the economy. It doesn't mean it was a very simple, positive experience, but they were major contributors to the economy, to the country, to the culture. Something happened, and just to give you numbers, Babylonia conquers Judea. They destroy Jerusalem, they destroy the temple, they take most of the Jews into exile. That happens in 586 before the Common Era. So that's the destruction of Israel the first time. I'm just making a sidebar. Before Babylonia did that, the previous empire in the north, Assyria, Ashur, they were the ones who did what the Russians did to the Ukrainians living in the Crimea. They essentially took them out of their homeland and spread them throughout the empire. The Assyrians had done that to many of the 10 tribes. The reason we have a phrase of 10 lost tribes is they were taken and they were sent and spread throughout the empire. A group that referred to themselves as the Samaritans, they were brought from different parts of the empire into northern Israel. And unfortunately, the 10 tribes, we don't have that many remainders of them. Most of these people ended up assimilating. There were minority members of each of the tribes that ultimately moved south to Judea, became part of the Empire of Judea. When Judea expanded north into the area of the 10 tribes, many of the 10 tribes returned, but all, I would say, for the most part, a minority of the 10 tribes. Most of the 10 tribes have been lost. We have minorities of each of the tribes that are part of the Jewish people, but most of the Jews were the inhabitants of Judea, the two southern tribes. Babylonia is the one who came in, took over Israel, conquered it, destroyed the temple, destroyed Jerusalem, and majority, not all, the majority of the population were taken into exile, and that's the Babylonian exile. Galut Bavel in Hebrew. Something happened that no one anticipated. Imagine, from a James Bond museum, imagine a Mossad hit squad or, that kind of a CIA hit squad. They came in, the Persian and the Medians. Who are the Persians and the Medians? Today's Iran. Okay, that's Parasumadai, Persian Media. They came in and they assassinated Belshazzar. He was the Babylonian emperor. With his assassination, a free fall happened where it just shocked the whole system. There was a lack of leadership, and as a function of that lack of leadership, the government fell. It was against all odds. Vegas would not have put a bet on the Persian-Median alliance to defeat Babylonia, but that's exactly what happened. And by defeating the Babylonians, the Persians became the controllers of the civilized world. Under Ahasuerus, Artaxerxes, the Persian Empire expanded above and beyond today's Arabian Gulf, above and beyond today's Mesopotamia or Fertile Crescent, meaning Iran and Iraq, above and beyond the Middle East, Israel, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, that was all for sure. But Persia ended up conquering parts of North Africa. Persia ended up expanding its empire all the way along what we call the trade route, all the way to India. To quote the phrase in the Bible, Mehodu va'ad Kush, from India as far as Black Africa. That was the extent of the empire, a massive, massive empire. And they controlled and they dominated the civilized world. The first Persian emperor, the one who was, so to speak, the leader of the Persian-Median alliance that defeated Babylonia, meaning in modern terms, Iran defeats Iraq. His name was Qurash, and that's the Persian word for it. In the Bible, it's Koresh, that's the Hebrew word. In English, the word is Cyrus. Cyrus the Great. What does he do? He turns to the Jews and he says that the God of Israel, now he did this with other groups as well, the God of Israel has enabled me, has given me the power, the ability to liberate you. Please feel free to go back to your homeland. Please feel free to rebuild your holy city, Jerusalem, to rebuild the temple, which is the educational center of your people. And just, remember that I'm a good guy. And he set up a very advantageous tax structure that benefited the Persian Empire. To a great degree, it was a win-win. The tragedy is that the Jews had done very well first under Babylonia, and now they saw business opportunities under Persia. And not many Jews went back. In fact, we know how many Jews went back. About 43,000, because it's listed in the book of Ezra. Many of them genealogically had issues, the bastards, the people who had questionable genealogy, people who had nothing to lose because they were broke. These were the people that went back. Unfortunately, the leadership, the business community, even the religious leadership, not all of them followed Ezra, who was a great, great scholar, who was respected and revered by Jew and Gentile alike. Nehemiah, who was a major figure in the government he ultimately, Nehemiah in English, he ultimately asks for permission, and he goes there and he supports Ezra as a political leader. And eventually, over a long period of time, Jews will return to Israel. It started out very slowly, and that hurt the community, and that hurt the whole development. I'll give you just a modern analogy. When the state of Israel was created, there were 600,000 inhabitants there. You didn't see Jews from Western Europe. You didn't see Jews from America, Canada, Australia moving to Israel. Today, there's between 9 and 10 million people in Israel. At that time, there were 600,000. Had Jews returned, now again, over 75 years, Israel's gone from being a very weak economic country to a very dynamic, high-tech economy. It's an economy that has exploded. It's gone from being the Jaffa orange, being the number one export, to serious cyber technology, biotechnology, other forms of technology being the number one export. America used to be the largest Jewish population on earth. That's no longer true. Israel went from being maybe the 5th or 6th largest population of Jews on earth today to the number one population of Jews on earth. In terms of dynamic Jewish, whether it's Talmudic scholarship, Jewish philosophical scholarship, whether it's scientific research, whether it is cutting-edge technology, Israel by far has trumped and surpassed any of the diaspora communities. The American community has more wealth than the Israeli community. But in terms of you looking at the future, young, dynamic, intelligent Israeli Jews relative to young, dynamic, intelligent American Jews, clearly Israel's far surpassed us. It's a function of their birth rate. It's a function of their commitment to Jewish values, Jewish principles, the Jewish people. And you have a situation where over 75 years, Israel has become the center of world Jewry, the most dynamic Jewish community on earth. That is an exact parallel to what happened after the Persians conquered the Babylonians. It was a slow process, but eventually the majority of Jews will return to Israel. Now, one of the catalysts for that to happen is something that all of you are familiar with. It's called the Purim story, because world Jewry almost faced a genocide. It was a near genocide. And the catharsis, the introspection, the reflection, the repentance that was done by world Jewry really shook them. Unfortunately, it took the catalyst of Haman wanting to annihilate the Jews, getting license to open up all the garrisons where the population could become armed and use those arms against the Jews, that ultimately shook the Jews. But the Jews went through a catharsis, and that was a huge catalyst in the beginning of a shift of the diaspora community returning to Israel. Look, we're seeing similar things today. What's happened, whereas, I'll give you an example or a contrast. A South African Jew, if you ask them, who are you? They say, I'm a Jew who lives in South Africa. South African Jew never define themselves as a South African, because whether it's the whites or the blacks, a Jew is always a Jew. You're another, okay? That's true of Jews in Colombia. It's true of Jews in other parts of South America as well. It's true of a Jew in Ireland, okay? A Jew in Ireland is not an Irishman who happens to be Jewish. A Jew in Ireland is an other. He's a Jew. American Jewry, we had the arrogance, we had the naivete to say we're Americans. We're Americans who happen to be Jewish. Well, October 7th really changed that reality. It woke up the 75 to 80% of Americans, I'm talking about American Jews, who defined themselves as Americans who happen to be Jewish. Today, a large percentage of American Jews will say, I'm a Jew who lives in America. Because it's been made clear to the Jew that you are an other. It's been made clear to the Jew how the Jew is perceived, particularly on the college campuses, particularly in certain parts of the media, in certain parts of American culture, in certain parts of certain states in America. It's been made very, very clear that a Jew is another, okay? A Jew is an outsider. And what happens is, just look at the aliyah rate that we have today. If you look at the number of American Jews, Canadian Jews, British Jews, if you look at the number of French Jews who are applying to aliyah, it doesn't mean they're all going to move to Israel within the year. But it does mean these are Jews who are already taking the first step. They're already becoming citizens of Israel. We are seeing very clearly what we saw with the downfall of the Soviet Union, the massive migration to Israel. We're seeing what we saw with the migration of Ethiopian Jewry, with the migration of Jews from the Arab lands already in the 1950s. We're starting now to see a trend of Western Jews becoming more connected to Israel, moving to Israel, raising their children in Israel, or raising their children in the diaspora to settle in Israel. A similar trend to what we saw during the return of the first diaspora, the return from the Babylonian/Persian diaspora. We're starting to see that happening in Western civilization, meaning in Christian Europe and in Christian America. We're starting to see that trend as well. So the Persian, and please understand something, Persia dominated the world. Persia controlled the world. If you go to Greece on vacation, let's say you go to Athens or go to other parts of Greece, look at all of the great antiquities in Greece. They're all tributes to their pagan gods for the defeat of the Persian Empire. They are all, so to speak, temples dedicated to their gods for what? For the great conquest by Greece of the Persian Empire. Now let's dig into that. What happened? There was no such thing as a united Greece. You had Troy, you had Athens, you had Macedonia, and they were always fighting each other. The game changer was that Philip of Macedonia conquered Athens, conquered Troy, conquered the other various components. And once he unified under Macedonia, we'll call it in Hebrew Yavan, in English we call it Greece. When Yavan or Greece becomes one dominant, it's interesting, if you talk today to a Macedonian, they'll correct you. They say, don't call it Greece. Don't call it the Greek Empire. It was the Macedonian Empire. Whatever you want to call it. Once it was united, under Philip's son, Alexander, and keep in mind, Alexander had one of the greatest personal tutors you could ever ask for. In Hebrew, we refer to him as Aristo. In English, Aristotle. Aristotle influenced Alexander. The world refers to him as Alexander the Great. The Jews throughout history, we call him Alexander Hamakdon, Alexander of Macedonia. So Alexander of Macedonia goes on to defeat the Persian Empire. And that was a massive change in the geopolitics of the world. The world is no longer controlled and conquered and driven by what will happen in Iran and Persia. No, the world is now controlled by who? By the Macedonians or the Greeks, in particular by Alexander. Now, why is it important for us to mention that his personal tutor was Aristotle? The reason that's crucial for us to understand is because when Alexander comes to Israel, and the Talmud records the meeting that he had with Shimon HaTzadik, we call him Simon the Righteous. Shimon was one of the great high priests. Now remember, high priest is a Christian word. When we say Kohen Gadol, we mean he was the head of the whole educational establishment. He was responsible for the education of Jews throughout the length and breadth of Israel. And again, at this time, most Jews lived in Israel. They no longer lived on the Euphrates and the Tigris. They no longer lived in Persia. They primarily lived where? In Israel. And he has this encounter. And he sees that Judaism is a religion that's rooted in rationality, in wisdom. It's a legal system that's a very sophisticated system. And he has incredible respect for Shimon HaTzadik, for the Kohen Gadol, the high priest Simon. And he has incredible respect for the Jewish religion. Okay, not that he's a Jew, not that he's going to conduct himself like a Jew, but he had a respect for intellect, he had a respect for wisdom, and a respect for rationality. And because of that, he really gave, he gave the Jews certain opportunities, and he set up a structure that was fairly moderate, philo-Semitic, relative to other countries that he conquered who he had no respect for. Things in that sense started out very well for the Jews. But what happened shortly after the conquest of the world is a real monkey wrench came into the system. Alexander of Macedonia, Alexander the Great, dies. How did he die is really a debate amongst historians. Some want to say, we know that Alexander had epilepsy, that he literally choked on his tongue in his sleep. He died of an epileptic fit. That's what some want to say. Others have a more cynical approach, and they say that he was poisoned to death. We don't know. We can't prove it one way or the other, but those are the two theories. One thing that did happen that we all know is that there is no man who can replace Alexander of Macedonia, Alexander the Great. And with his death, the empire that controls the civilized world breaks up into three. One empire, 1/3 of the empire, is based in Alexandria, Egypt. It's known as the Ptolemaic Empire. Who's Ptolemy? P, it's a silent P. Ptolemy. The Ptolemaic Empire is controlled by first Ptolemy the general, then ultimately others. Philadelphus II is probably the most famous of the Ptolemaic emperors. And Israel is initially part of the Ptolemaic Empire. The second part of the empire is based in Damascus. Seleucid, or depending on how you pronounce it, Seleucid. Seleucid. Who was Seleucid or Seleucid? He was another general, and he took that part of the world. And then the third part of the empire was back in Macedonia, Greece, today what we refer to as Greece and the Balkans. So the empire split into three. Now, the most important piece of the real estate in that empire is Israel. Why is Israel the most important piece of real estate? For a very simple reason. Israel is the linchpin. Israel is, if you want to control the three continents and trade between the three continents and transportation and commerce between the three continents, you have to control Israel. Because how do you get from Africa into Asia or Europe? How do you get from Europe or Asia into Africa? Through Israel. And because of that, everybody wants Israel. So initially it was part of the Ptolemaic Empire. Many of you have heard the term the Septuagint, which in English is the translation of the 70 scholars. The translation of the Hebrew Bible into Greek took place when Israel was under the influence, under the control, and under the domination of the Ptolemaic Empire, of the let's call it the Greco-Egyptian Empire. It's another way of saying it, based in its capital in Alexandria. The Seleucidians, the Greco-Syrians, or the Damascus Empire, the Greco-Syrians, they conquer Israel from the Greco-Egyptians. Very important to know that. That's when things turn sour. That's when things turn bad. Why? So you have a situation where there are many Hellenistic Jews who want to be Hellenists, believe in Hellenism, and are looking to undermine Judaism, reject many parts of Judaism. And you have a very aggressive Greco-Syrian empire that wants everyone falling in line. Everyone, I don't want to say being monolithic, but being close to monolithic. They're threatened by the fact that the Jews are monotheistic. They relate to an abstract, ethereal God. They don't relate to a polytheistic, to a God of the sun, to a God of the moon, to a God of love, to a God of this, to a God of that. They also cherish the human body. Remember, the Olympiad is a Greek creation. The original concept of the Olympics is what? It's a pageant of the human body. The male performers, the female performers, they performed in the nude. Because again, it's a pageant of the human body. Well, the Jews engage in something called circumcision. That was vile in the mind of the Greeks. And again, we're not talking about Greece. We're talking about the Damascus Syrians, the Greco-Syrians. Their philosophy was Hellenistic. Their philosophy was Greek. But the empire was based out of Damascus. And the Greco-Syrians, with the encouragement of many Jews, started engaging in horrific decrees against the mainstream Jewish community in Israel. And understand, this is what I'm going to say now is crucial. Understand that there is no way this could have happened without the guidance, the encouragement of the Hellenistic Jews, of their fellow Jews who basically ratted them out, who basically, worked against them. And let's explain what that means. There were a number of decrees to undermine Judaism. Number one, the most significant, is the prohibition of Jewish education. The argument was this: as long as the Jews are thoughtful, sophisticated, are rooted in their own moral system, are rooted in their own theological system, that's a dynamic Judaism. If we can stop Jewish education, you produce uneducated, dumb Jews, then eventually they'll fall in line, they'll assimilate, and they'll become Hellenistic, which is what we want. So number one was a prohibition of Jewish education. Many people, they spin the dreidel on Hanukkah. Where does that come? What is spinning the dreidel? It was a subterfuge. The Jewish educators, the Kohanim, and again, priest is a bad translation. It means the educators. What did the Kohanim do? They could tell if somebody was an authority, either a Greco-Syrian soldier, a Greco-Syrian authority. That they could tell. What they couldn't tell is, was this Jew a Hellenist who was going to rat them out to the authorities? Was this Jew spying against their fellow Jews on behalf of the Greco-Syrians? So what they did was they had the subterfuge of the dreidel. So they looked like they were youth leaders playing games with the kids or doing activities with the kids, when that was really a subterfuge to educate Jews at a time when Jewish education was banned. Another subterfuge, and many of you are familiar with this, the Haftarah, the thesis that's quoted by the famous Spanish medieval commentator, Rabbi David Avuduram, who's really one of the classic commentators on the Jewish prayer book. He says, what was the institution of the Haftarah? They prohibited the Torah reading. They prohibited, and remember, Torah reading was not just the reading of the Torah, it was also the Targum Onkelos, it was the explanation and translation. So each and every Torah reading was an explanation of the Parsha. Well, that became prohibited. So they came to them and they said, look, we have a principle. One of the philosophical principles of Judaism is that Jewish law is only something that's a jurisdiction of Moses, of the prophecy of Moses that we call the Torah. The role of a prophet after the fact, the Isaiahs, the Jeremiahs, the Zechariahs, the Ezekiels, the Samuels, The role of a prophet is really to try to instill in the Jews good behavior, to highlight or to focus on one of the principles of the Torah that the Jews may be lax in. And it's a way of getting Jews, and they gave the example of Jeremiah 29, to show respect and to show respect to the authorities that run the country, et cetera, et cetera. So it could be the Jews, how to treat the elderly, how to treat their laborers, their employees. Well, that they said, we're okay with that because you want a moral society. You have a moral society of people conducting themselves with principles in business where there's no anarchy and there's no hysteria and chaos. That's actually good for us. So they allowed them to read the prophets because, after all, it's not Jewish education. It's more of encouragement of good behavior. That subterfuge of the Haftorah enabled the Jews, because what Haftorah did they always choose? Somewhere from the prophets that would take a theme of the weekly parsha and highlight it, emphasize it. So the whole notion of the Jewish world studying the weekly parsha, the weekly Torah portion, was continued through what? Through the Haftorah. These are examples of things, subterfuges of how they tried to exist under these conditions. Another example, they banned circumcision. They didn't want a distinction which demarcated the Jews. Another example, they banned the observance of the Sabbath. Shabbat or Shabbos observance was banned. Now we know the famous phrase, it was actually coined by a Gentile. More than the Jews keep the Sabbath, it's the Sabbath that has kept the Jews over the last 4,000 years. And we can all testify that. It's the Shabbat. You look at a community where there's a commitment to Shabbat. It defines the community. It anchors the community. It roots the community. It's where all community needs are taken care of. It's where families bond. It's where family moments are made. It's where dialogue between generations happens. It's where serious Jewish education happens. It's where serious social communal building takes place. And they banned the observance of the Sabbath. What was the fourth thing they did? They banned the lunar calendar, where we started today's discussion. By banning the lunar calendar, you can't declare Rosh Chodesh if you can't declare when is the first of the month, when's Rosh Chodesh, the new moon, then there's no Rosh Hashanah, there's no Yom Kippur, there's no Passover, there's no Purim. So they banned the lunar calendar and what we call Kiddush HaChodesh, the declaration of when is the first of the month. Again, that's not something that you can figure out by itself because, as we said earlier, a lunar month is 29 and a half days. It's 29 days, 12 hours, and a few minutes. So what you end up having is certain months end up being 29-day months, others 30-day months. And depending on what you're declaring the month as, will determine what days Rosh Hashanah, when's Yom Kippur, when's Passover, when's Sukkot, when's Purim, when's Shavuot, when's Tisha B'Av, etc. What was the fifth of the decrees? It wasn't so much a legal decree. The Greco-Syrians broke into the temple. In 13 different places, there was a mechitza, there was a barrier, where up to that point, Gentiles were welcome to participate, but beyond that point was just for Jews. They broke through in 13 places. By the way, if you want to see a section of the temple grounds of the Holy Temple, it's known as the Chil or the Soreg in the Turkish Museum. And you see in Greek, in Latin, and in Aramaic, it's written, that everyone is welcome until this point, which is the majority of the Temple Mount. This is to quote King Solomon, Ki beisi beis tefillah yikarei l'chol amim. My home, meaning the temple, the God's home, is a home of prayer for all nations. Everyone is welcome. But beyond that point, not. Well, they broke through, they go beyond that point. They take out the Torah, they burn it. They establish Greek gods in the innermost, in the innermost sanctums of the temple. They establish Greek pagan gods. They take over control of the altar. I mean, it was a disaster. They took over control of the temple. They didn't destroy the temple, they took control of it. So these are the 5 things that happened. A group of educators led by Matisyahu ben Yochanan Cohen Gadol. Matisyahu is like, Matthew in English, okay? He had a whole group of sons who were incredibly loyal to their father, incredibly thoughtful educators, and incredibly dynamic leaders. He was a great leader. He produced great leaders. The most famous of his son, we call him Judah Maccabee, Yehuda. There's another son, Shimon, Simon. There's another son, Elazar, right? The community south of Jerusalem, Elazar, is named after him. So he had many sons. They convened the educators. They convened the scholars, the Sanhedrin, and they said, look, we have an issue here. Judaism is about to be lost. When Judaism's lost, the Jews will end up assimilating like any other group that's assimilated first into Persian culture. Now they're becoming Hellenists. Again, we're not telling other people what to do or how to act. But when they prohibit Jews from having religious freedom, when they prohibit Jews from having religious autonomy, when they prohibit Jews from practicing Judaism in their own homeland, the question is, do we have a right to bear arms and defend our religion and defend our way of life, defend our theology, defend our moral code, defend our ethical system? And I'm going to come back to this, but I want to make a very important digression. The Rambam Maimonides, when he analyzes this, he makes it very clear that as much as this was an attack on Judaism, it says, Pashtu yadam b'mamonam uvivnotehem. The Greco-Syrians extended their control in terms of raiding and stealing our wealth, in terms of also violating our daughters. And what was that? There's a term called the hegemon in Greece, like hegemony comes from that term. The various Greco-Syrian governors of these various districts of Israel, they had a rule. When the virgin bride, the night of her wedding, he would have first dibs. He would violate, so to speak, the virginity of the Jewish bride. After that, she could be with her husband. Now you can imagine the trauma this caused to Jewish women. Just think of what happened October 7th. Imagine the trauma what this causes to Jewish women. And there's no ability to stop this. So between what they did to our daughters, what they did to our wealth, but most significantly, what was happening to the destruction of Judaism, they convened and they said, look, this is license for us to bear arms and to defend our theology, our daughters, and our assets. And by the way, the assets were third. It was the theology and the daughters first. And let me make this very clear. If you go to war, three things happen. Number one, you're going to be killing Greco-Syrians. Number two, it's suicide because many of you are going to die. Number three, you're going to be killing your fellow Jews because many of the Hellenistic Jews were fighting and supporting with the Greco-Syrians. So you got the mainstream Jewish community, but there's a minority of Jews fighting along the Greco-Syrians. So you're killing Jews, you're killing Gentiles, and you're committing suicide because going to war by definition means that many of you are going to die. And they weighed and they deliberated. And they said clearly, both for the sake, not for the sake of our money, but both for the sake of our theology and religious freedom, as well as for the sake of our daughters, we have every right to go to war over this. Now, they weren't an army. There's no Jewish army. This was controlled by the Greco-Syrians. Before that, by the Greco-Egyptians. Before that, by the Persians. Before that, by the Babylonians, right? Israel had been a vassal controlled by others. And Israel would have continued to be a vassal controlled by others had this not been a war against our religion and against our daughters. And they go to war. For lack of a better term, it was a guerrilla war. They knew the terrain better. They used it. Now, Vegas would have never given them odds. The Greco-Syrians had elephants. The Greco-Syrians were weaponized, had far superior weapons, had far superior numbers. But the Jews were fighting for the survival of Judaism. Remember, this was not an attack against Jews, it was an attack against Judaism. So yes, by default, it was an attack against any Jew who wanted to study Jewish education, to learn Torah. By default, it was an attack against any Jew who wanted to observe the Shabbat, Shabbos observers. By default, it was against any Jew who circumcised their child. But it wasn't a war against Jews, it was a war against Judaism and the defense of Judaism was a very significant one. And it wasn't easy. And many Jews were killed. Eventually, they're able to, against all odds, defeat the Greco-Syrians. And the Greco-Syrians kept coming back and back and back. The Hanukkah story was the first defeat of the Greco-Syrians, where we actually reconquered Jerusalem, retook Jerusalem. We're able to go in on the 25th of the third month of the Jewish calendar year, the third lunar month, Kislev, 25th of that month. They were able to go in, remove all of the pagan gods, all of the Greek gods, and reestablish Jewish control of the temple. Now, the menorah, the famous menorah, unfortunately, they were lacking because everything had been defiled. There turned out to be one sealed with the seal of the high priest vessel of oil that would have lasted a night. Before they could go purify themselves, produce new extra virgin olive oil, really refined olive oil, which was necessary for it, was going to take 8 days. Well, the one flask of oil, which should have lasted 12 hours, ended up lasting 8 days. Now the way they viewed that defiance of the laws of physics, that miracle of the oil, they viewed that as a reflection, as a statement on the whole war itself. This war should have never been won by the Jews. You're dealing with going up against a trained professional military that has Jewish traitors in the midst of Israel. And who's fighting against them? It's being led by educators, by Jewish teachers. That's who's the Kohanim, the priests. They're the ones who are leading it. In one of the programs that we fund in the IDF, it's called Bigvut HaChashmonaim. One of the experiences that takes place during Soldier Recharge Week, or at other times during the year, is they take the soldiers through the various battlegrounds, through the various locations throughout the length and breadth of Israel, that the Maccabees, meaning the educators and their followers, fought against the Greco-Syrians. They knew the terrain better. It was, they were committed. This was their religion. This was their land. This was their people. And it shows how they defied all odds, in upsetting and defeating the Greco-Syrians. Now, the Greco-Syrians keep coming back. Eleazar is killed, Judah's killed, Simon's killed. The various brothers eventually die in ensuing battles. But Judaism has been liberated. There's a freedom of religion. Never, ever again will the Greco-Syrians prevent the Sabbath observance. Never, ever again will the Greco-Syrians gain control of Jerusalem. And that the temple, which was the educational center of the Jewish world, for the majority of Jews living in Israel, for the minority living throughout the Greek diaspora, once again, it will service. The Sanhedrin can function. It can now go again and function as a legislative body, as a Supreme Court, because remember, it's the ultimate legislative body, the Sanhedrin, and it's a Supreme Court. From Jerusalem, it plays that role. Jewish education now. There's an explosion. There's a dynamic explosion of Jewish education and educators. And there's a thirst for Judaism because they see what Hellenism was. Under the guise of sophistication, under the guise of a value system, it was a system of rape. It was a system of pillaging of Jewish wealth. And they lost all respect for Greek culture. They lost all respect for the primitive polytheism that existed. This is not the Greek culture that was influenced by Socrates or by Plato or by Aristotle. This is the Greek culture that proved itself for all of its primitive, grotesque, worship of the human body, superstition, primitive fear of the god of the sun, the god of sex, the god of the moon, the god of this, the god of that. And it just was a turnoff to Jews. And Jews realized, what did we sell? Our system of ethics and morals, our sophisticated system of ethical monotheism, for that? Shame on us. And there was a serious, sophisticated Jewish revival and an incredible respect for these Jewish educators who had liberated our nation from the Greco-Syrians, from the Damascus Greeks. And of course, until this day, we do a number of things. Number one is we celebrate that. We celebrate the miracle of light, and light, in a conceptual, on a euphemistic level, is referring to the light of knowledge, the light of true knowledge. But we celebrate the miracle that defied the laws of physics, which is also a celebration of this war of liberation, of this war that liberated us from the tyranny and the oppression of the Greco-Syrians and its Hellenistic value system. As well, even though today we don't need to read the Haftorah, we have the Torah reading. We study the Torah each and every week. And today, thank God to organizations like ArtScroll and others, the most sophisticated commentaries that we have throughout the millennia of Judaism, whether it's the masters of the Medrash, whether it's the great commentaries of the great medieval scholars like Rashi from France, Ramban from Spain, we study that. And rabbis each and every week, if they're doing their job as a rabbi, explain the Parsha, its significance, its relevance to us. Okay? Why we read the Haftarah? So the answer that this great medieval Spanish scholar, Rabbi David Abu-Durham, gives, it's a statement of historical gratitude. Because during those terrible, terrible years, which led to the revolt, which led to the insurrections, looking at 168 BCE, and it was 5 years before we could free Jerusalem. It was 163 BCE. That's the year in which, so to speak, the miracle of Hanukkah took place. During that time, during that period leading up to it, it was this smart subterfuge of the Haftarah that kept Jewish education alive. Not ideal Jewish education of studying each and every day, each and every evening publicly. It had to be done very privately, but this was the one public act. On Saturday morning, they all came together to learn to study the Haftarah, which could at least take the message of the Torah and project it and show its relevance. That was huge. It kept public Jewish education alive during the worst of times. And each and every week, we commemorate this incredible act of sacrifice by the Jewish educators, the Kohanim, and by the Jewish people to defy, the empire that dominated and shaped the globe. And if I could, that's why Hanukkah is one of the great moments in Jewish history. It saved Judaism. It saved Jewish education. It saved the Sabbath. It saved our lunar calendar, which defines our whole experience throughout the year. And it saved the Jews. More importantly, it saved the Jews because they would have assimilated out and been like, they would have intermarried out, assimilated out and been like everyone else. And that would have been the end of Judaism, and end of the Jewish system and what Judaism brought the world. Let's leave 163 BCE. Let's leave the original Hanukkah for a moment. Just parenthetically, and very important, the Sanhedrin. And it's interesting, Sanhedrin is a Greek word. The Sanhedrin is the 71 leading scholars. It is the legislative body of the Jewish people / the high court of the Jewish people. A year later, they looked back and they saw the impact. And they saw that this was not just a one-time shot, and everybody forgot about it and moved on with their lives. Unfortunately, many people didn't appreciate the miracle in our lifetime of the Six-Day War, the magnitude of what the Six-Day War did for Israel, for the Jewish world. Many did, but many did not. And they moved on with their lives. And it's just, it's a marker in the history book. They saw that the Jews appreciated, and the Jews were transformed by what happened in 163 before the Common Era, the 5 years leading up to it, and then the culmination of 163 BCE. And a year later, they legislated the observance of Hanukkah. What does that mean, the observance of Hanukkah? Two things. We light each and every night the candles, to commemorate, to recreate that miracle and to publicize that miracle. That's why preferably it's done in a window facing the street or out by the front door facing the street. It's something we publicize to the world. And then each and every morning we add to the prayer service the Hallel, Psalms 113 through 118, which do what? Which express to our gratitude verbally. The act of lighting the candles expresses our gratitude to God and publicizes the miracle through action. In the morning, we articulate it verbally. And that is the famous Hallel prayer that was instituted to commemorate on each of the 8 days of Hanukkah. When we light the candles, we have this famous paragraph, Haneros Halalu. What does it do? It explains to us, lest we forget, or it articulates to us, lest we forget, what we're demonstrating, what we're publicizing when we light the candles. Going to the aftermath of this story, of one of the great moments in Jewish history, the moment in Jewish history that saved Judaism, the war that saved the Jewish religion, that saved our freedom to observe, our freedom to study, our freedom to practice, and ultimately kept Jews throughout the millennia. Here we are 2,200 years later, and we're still alive and well, thank God. So we refer to the IDF as our modern day Maccabees. The IDF is much more structured, is much more of a system than these educators were. But what the modern day Maccabees have done is the exact same thing. Today, the attack by Shia Islam and its partner, the Muslim Brotherhood, which is a radical branch of Sunni Islam, against Israel, and I'm referring to the Ring of Fire, that Iran has spent 40 years creating around Israel, whether it's the Shia in Western Iraq, the Shia in Syria, the Shia Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Shia Houthi in Yemen, the forces in Jordan that are trying to overthrow King Abdullah and use Jordan as a vehicle to get terrible weapons into Judea and Samaria. And of course, the Muslim Brotherhood that exists in Judea, Samaria, and Hamas, that exists in Gaza and Hamas. And that's by, again, we've mentioned this before. Why are Hamas viewed as the filth of the earth? Why are they despised? I'm not talking about by Christians and Jews. Why is the Palestinian Hamas considered the scum of the earth? Because they're the ones taking the blood money from the Shia, from the heretical Shia, the hated Shia. Sunni Islam hates the Shia. Sunni Islam has spent 1,400 years trying to eradicate the Shia. How do you, our fellow Sunni brothers, you go and take money from them and use that and go to bed with the Shia? That's why the Palestinians, in the eyes of the Sunni world, are the worst despicable scum on the face of the earth. And again, that's not the way we as Jews look at them. That's not the way the Christian world looks at them. That's the way that their fellow Sunni Muslims look at them. Despised. And I'm not referring to Fatah. I'm referring to specifically Hamas and the PIJ, which again is the majority of the Muslim Brotherhood, is the majority in Gaza, and it's exceedingly popular in Judea and Samaria. It's not all Palestinians, and I want to make that clear. It's not Fatah. but it is the popular movement, both in quote unquote the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, and for sure it's the majority in Gaza. So what happens? This ring of fire, which is again 8 groups of Shia, 8 groups of Shia in Syria and Yemen, in Lebanon, in Iraq and Iran, and of course the Sunni Muslim Brotherhood in Gaza and the Sunni Muslim Brotherhood in Judea and Samaria. So that ring of fire, which his goal is to wear down the Jews, to wear down Israel. We have seen our own Hanukkah. The miracles of the last 3.5 months, and I'm using that word literally. Could you and I have ever imagined that the chemical weapons that the Alawite Shia Assad used to murder Christians and to murder Sunni Muslims in Syria, the horrific regime that was ultimately propped up by the Shia Hezbollah and by Iran to butcher 500,000 Sunni Muslims, to have 11 million Sunni Muslims as refugees throughout the world, the refugee crisis in Europe, the Sunni Muslim refugees in Turkey and Lebanon, in Jordan, where Jordan, the 3rd largest city, was a Syrian Sunni refugees. Now what do you see? They're flooding back to their homeland. They're flooding back to their homes, to their farms. And the weapons of mass destruction that the Assad region, which was a puppet of Iran, was warehousing and storing for the Hezbollah Shia. Those weapon houses, those storehouses have been blown up. Israel, in the course of the last week and a half, has destroyed the Syrian Air Force, destroyed the Syrian Navy, destroyed the chemical weapons that were used to butcher and slaughter Sunni Muslims. Israel's been the great liberator of the Sunni Muslim world. And the Sunnis are all saying it. This could have never happened. They could have never had the ability to overthrow the Alawite Shias, Assad, the horrific Assad regime that was propped up by Iran and propped up by Hezbollah, had it not been for what Israel did to the Hezbollah. While the world condemned Israel for the pagers, for the walkie-talkies, for the destruction of the tunnels, of the weapons, the 170,000 rockets that were going to be used to slaughter Jews throughout Israel. What have we seen? 85% of those rockets, 85% of the drones, the killer drones used against Jews to kill innocent men, women, and children. It's all been destroyed in the last couple of months by these young Jews that we call the IDF, the 18 to 21-year-old men and women. I call them boys and girls. My daughter is in the Air Force. She's a girl, my little baby girl, okay? They're 18 to 21-year-olds. And the 22 to 35-year-old reservists who's given up their wives, given up their children, given up their jobs, given up their university education to save Jews, to save Israel, to save Sunni Islam. And what, unfortunately, Western civilization doesn't appreciate is to save Christianity, to save Christian America, to save Christian Europe. And you'll laugh at me for saying such a thing. You've all heard it from the head of the octopus, from Ayatollah, the same Ayatollah who in the name of religion is running a $10 billion business called Captagon, where they're poisoning, they're getting people throughout the Middle East, throughout Europe, addicted to this drug Captagon. This is what fuels and funds the Assad regime in Syria to $2.5 billion. That's what fuels and funds the Hezbollah, other Shiite groups in Iraq and Iran under the control of Khomeini. So in the name of religion, they're the worst drug traders on earth. They're worse than the drug cartels in South America. And that's how they fund their ring of fire. And who has destroyed these manufacturing sites in Syria? The Israeli Air Force. You know the millions of people that will now no longer become addicted to Captagon? You can thank Israel for that. And this ring of fire that was such a threat to Israel but was a much greater threat to Sunni Islam, was a much greater threat to the Western civilization, meaning the Christian world, Christian Europe and Christian America. And you heard the head of the octopus, every one of you, 8 times in the last years, saying our goal, what is our goal? It's not Israel. Israel's the canary in the coal mine. It's the great Satan. It's the great Satan. Great Satan is not just America. America is the poster child. The great Satan is Christianity. It's Western civilization. That's their goal, is to conquer Western civilization. Okay? Well, that ring of fire is now falling apart. While all the idiots are running around the campuses saying, free us from the occupation, from the river to the sea, all the idiots running around that. Guess what? The Muslim Brotherhood, that's right, the Palestinian rapists, the Palestinian baby killers, the Palestinian monsters who butcher their own people, who kill the Fatah, who kill the Jews, who kill their fellow Sunni Muslims, who are in bed taking blood money, Captagon money from Iran, they have been defeated, much to the consternation of the professors on our campuses, much to the consternation of those who are running around destroying property in America, making TikTok videos. Well, you know what? The ring of fire of the Shia Caliphate is now imploded. They still exist. They still exist in Western Iraq. There are still Houthis. There are still Hamas terrorists, but they're terrorists. They have destroyed their own people in Gaza. And Israel has liberated their people in Gaza. And Israel has liberated the Sunni Muslims in Syria. And Israel has liberated the Christians and the Sunni Muslims in Lebanon. But let's not forget, the IDF, the modern day Maccabees, they've liberated us. Because with all the sacrifice they've made, and that sacrifice is huge. We've lost over 815 soldiers. We still have hostages in Gaza. How many are suffering from PTSD that you and I are funding, that we're trying to prevent their lives from being ruined? How many have prosthetics? They've lost limbs. But that sacrifice has made Israel a much safer place than it's been in the last 20 years. That sacrifice has taken away the strength of Iran and its proxies, and it's eliminated the ring of fire. Do they exist? Yes. Are they a threat? Yes. Are they close to what they were 15 months ago? No. The Hanukkah story didn't end with the liberation of Jerusalem. There were continuous battles for years. This story is not ending today. We will have to deal with them, and we'll have to defend ourselves against them. But this time from a position of strength. And Israel has a lot of rebuilding to do. And we're going to be there. We, the supporters, FIDF, who are there to support the Ministry of Defense and the army, the soldiers that have sacrificed. We're there to support them. Their mental health, their emotional health, their education, and they need to be educated. We who are there to support them, their well-being, their welfare. 50,000 soldiers are coming from families in poverty, and we're there to support them. But the sacrifice that they've made, these modern-day Maccabees, it has liberated Israel. It has liberated Sunni Islam. And what the world doesn't understand is it's in the process of liberating Western civilization from a Shia hegemonic caliphate that was bent on conquering the world. With the defeat of the Greco-Syrians was the defeat of Hellenism. And when I say Hellenism, I want to be very clear. A Hellenism that was threatened by anyone who would not follow and fall into its polytheistic theology, into its worship of the human body, into its need to control and dominate the earth. In Hellenism, with the loss of the Greco-Syrian forces to the Jewish educators, to those young Jews, Hellenism went on a downward trajectory. And Judaism has survived for 2,200 years as a function of the sacrifice of the Maccabees. And I'm telling you, Israel and Judaism will now survive as a sacrifice of the 815 who have given their lives, of the thousands and tens of thousands more who have sacrificed the past 15 months, their family, their education, their jobs, their economic security. Israel will rebuild. Israel's economy will rebuild. There's a revival of Judaism in America. There's a revival of Judaism across the globe. Because many Jews who were asleep in Israel and in the diaspora have woken up. We call them October 8th Jews. We have other terms. But they've woken up. They've aroused the Maccabee within us. And who do we have to thank for our defense? Who does the world have to thank for the prevention of a hegemonic Shia caliphate, of a recreation of Persia, of a modern-day Persia, and a much more virulent form, of a defeat of a modern-day Syria, the way we defeated the Syria of old in 163 BCE? Who do we have to thank for that? The modern-day Maccabees, the soldiers of the IDF. It's the end of the year. And I'm telling you now, I'm asking you for your help. I'm asking you to partner with me. We've committed over $252 million to the war campaign. So far, we've raised $183 million. Please reach out. Please support us, whether it's through FIDF.org. If you want to speak to me about a particular program, about sending one of these soldiers, providing them a full scholarship to get their education, about providing a therapy dog, about providing training psychologists who can provide PTSD, about adopting a battalion or adopting a brigade so that we can fund the soldiers that are coming from families that are in poverty. Any of the multiple programs that we do for education, whether it's educating those who are on the spectrum of autism, whether it's providing a high school education to those who don't have a high school education, whether it's professional job training for those who are not going to university, but are going to become electricians, going to become auto mechanics and plumbers, who are going to be able to support a family and build Israel that way. Whether it is to the needs of the bereaved families, the retreats, the programs for the orphans, the programs for the bereaved families, whether it is the therapy dogs for bereaved families. There are tens and tens of programs. If you're willing to support us, please reach out to me. Steve.Weil at FIDF.org. Steve.Weil at FIDF.org. We have a huge, huge responsibility to provide for these soldiers. The Ministry of Defense, the General Staff, when they ask us for the welfare or the needs of the soldiers, they're not asking for bells and whistles. They're asking for the most essential, critical needs that they don't have budgets themselves. If they have budgets, they'll take care of it themselves. What they're asking us for is things that they don't have budget for. Please partner with me. Please partner with FIDF as we take care of these modern-day Maccabees who have changed the world, not only for Israel, not only for Jews. They've changed the world for Sunni Islam and for Western civilization. They've sacrificed the ultimate sacrifice. And today the world is a far safer place because of their sacrifice. And I want to wish each and every one of you a blessed Hanukkah, a meaningful Hanukkah, a Hanukkah of light, a Hanukkah of the Spirit, and a Hanukkah of growth. Growth as individuals, growth as a family, and growth as a world community that, please God, this year will continue to be a far safer place as a function of these modern day Maccabees. Thank you.